Hi friends, you are welcome to the new video of Literature Simply. Friends, in the previous videos we talked about the classical critics Plato, Aristotle, Horace and Longinus. Now we are making a series in English criticism, and the very first English critic in this video we are going to discuss is Sir Philip Sidney. So let's start the tutorial and know about the English criticism and the very first critic, Sir Philip Sidney. So the discussion point of this lesson will be based on Sidney's An Apology for Poetry or Defense of Poesy, a treatise composed by Sidney. So let's start with some background about this very particular age of Sidney and its criticism. So how English criticism has evolved? It is considered that it is evolved, or the first English criticism started in the Tudor period, that is 1485 to 1606. It is also an Elizabethan period. So friends, this has started with three critics. The very first is Chequet, then we have Thomas Wilson, and there is another, a third critic, that is Roger Ascham. So these three critics were called regular critics in the sense that they started English criticism. And the next critic here we have Sir Philip Sidney. So why did Sir Philip Sidney has composed this work, An Apology for Poetry or the Defense of Poesy? So there are a obvious reason that a contemporary called Stephen Gosson has composed a treatise called School of Abuse, and in this School of Abuse he charged poetry. And to give answer to this particular treatise, Sir Philip Sidney has composed the work called An Apology for Poetry or Defense of Poetry. So friends, it is not only the answer to Stephen Gosson's charges against poetry, but it has widened the scope of English criticism, and there we find different aspects have been discussed in this essay. So first let's discuss the very structure or the division of this essay. We can divide this essay into some paragraphs, and there are total 91 paragraphs in this essay. So let's think about this division, or let's think about the structure of this essay. The very first 42 paragraphs are dedicated to why Sir Philip Sidney felt that it is necessary to write a book called An Apology for Poetry. So reasons are given 1 to 42. Again, there we also can find the nature of poetry and what is the function of poetry from paragraph 1 to 42. The second division we can make here is paragraph 43 to paragraph 55. In this paragraph he talked about the significance of poetry, or why poetry is significant, and again there are some demerits of poetry discussed in the same paragraphs. Again we have next division or paragraphs, paragraph number 56 to 66, and in these paragraphs he talks about the charges against poetry, or how Gosson has claimed that poetry is not useful for society. So these particular charges have been discussed, and answers or the refutation of these charges is given in these paragraphs. The next division is paragraph 67 to 88, and these paragraphs are exclusively devoted to what is the condition of contemporary poetry in those days. And last division here we can say that paragraph 89 to 91 is peroration, or we can say that it is in the form of conclusion. And here he revealed that how poetry is significant for the society, or how poetry has a particular place in the state. Now friends, let's see these very charges and the answers of Sir Philip Sidney. The very first we have to think about the significance and origin of poetry, which is the part of initial paragraphs of the treatise or the essay An Apology for Poetry. So what is the nature of poetry, or how did poetry origin? The very discussion Sir Philip Sidney has started in this essay is based on the ancient texts, or based on the ancient Greek masters. For example, he says that poetry is the oldest form or oldest branch, because in ancient Greece, in ancient Roman text, we find that all the knowledge came from poetry, or poetry is the only medium through which these scholars have or philosophers have shared their views, and they have spread their counsels through the medium of poetry. Again, he gives example of Plato, Aristotle, even he says that Herodotus also used the form verse to give his historical arguments or history. So this is what the very significance and the origin of poetry, here we can say that. And in the next paragraphs he talks about the definition and function of poetry. So let me read out the definition given by Sir Philip Sidney in his An Apology for Poetry. So here I have the very text or the definition of poetry. So I quote, "Poetry, therefore, is an art of imitation, for so Aristotle terms it in the word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth, to speak metaphorically, speaking picture with this aim to teach and delight." Now, friends, it is clear that he added a new element to the poetry or to the function of poetry. As we have seen that Aristotle talks about the imitation or theory of mimesis, that all literature is an imitation. Here he has given the same thread, that it is an imitation, but it is in the form of counterfeiting, means it provides, or poetry provides the option for us, or it is a speaking picture. Now he calls poetry as the speaking picture, because we recite poetry, we cite poetry, we compose poetry. So this is the very basic thing regarding the addition of Sir Philip Sidney to poetry. And in the same definition he talks about the function of poetry. He has given significance to the function of poetry, and the very function of poetry is teaching and giving entertainment or providing entertainment. So here he ranks teaching morality upper or above to the entertainment, because but he says that both are very integral to poetry, and the very function of poetry is to teach and provide delight or entertain, or we can say that these both tasks are significant in the eyes of Sir Philip Sidney. Then he talks about various kinds of poetry in the course of this essay, and he talked that there are different kinds of poetry, or this poetry may be evolved through new genres or new kinds, but he talks about the very basic kinds. Here let me read out these kind of poetry. First he talks about pastoral poetry. So there we have pastoral poetry. Again he talks about elegy. Then we have comic poems, tragic poems, lyrics, and heroic epic. So these all forms are significant in the poetry, or we can say that these forms were very practiced in the Sir Philip Sidney's period, or in the Tudor period, or we can say for that matter in Elizabethan period. And now we find there are other different forms which are evolved, and this has been stated already by Sir Philip Sidney. Then he compares poetry and other genres of knowledge. For example, he compares poetry and history, he compares poetry and philosophy, and he again compares poetry and theology and law. And in all these branches he says that poetry is superior, because poetry includes all these branches. So poetry works to provide pleasure, it teaches us the very work of philosophy. Again, it presents some facts in the form of different kinds of narratives as it is presented in history. So poetry is superior to all these branches. And in the course, or there we find, as we have talked about the fourth division, there he talks about the basic four charges against poetry. Now friends, let's talk about the four charges against poetry made by Stephen Gosson in his book School of Abuse. The very first charge is that poetry is waste of time, but according to Sidney, it is not waste of time, it is against it a very creative use of time. How it can be the waste of time if poetry provides knowledge, if poetry is very useful for not only poet but for the society. So this charge is refuted by Sir Philip Sidney in this way. And the second charge made by Gosson is that so poetry is mother of all lies. But again Sidney says that poetry is the mother of all knowledge, and it also presents the truth. So it is not mother of lies. So there may be some bad poets which have given you the bad taste or bad ideas, or which have spread bad ideas in the society, but it is not the mother of lies. The third charge against poetry made by Gosson is, it is the nurse of abuse, or we can say that poetry is immoral. But if poetry is presenting the truth, so it is accepted by Sidney that there are characters with fictitious names, or some fictional elements are included in poetry or literature. But the meaning of this is not that it is immoral, because it provides you the very truth, or poetry contains the truth, or the very base of poetry is truth, as he compared poetry with other genres and how poetry is superior is given in this comparison. And so it is not immoral, or it is not the nurse of abuse. The last charge here, or the fourth charge made by Gosson, is that Plato banished all poets from his ideal state. So here, though Plato banished all the poets, but he did not banish poetry, is the argument of Sir Philip Sidney. So Plato is not against poetry, but the bad poets. He is against the bad poets. And in this way, Sir Philip Sidney has given answer to all his charges against poetry, or he refuted all the charges here. So, and if we think about the value of Sir Philip Sidney's criticism, here we can say that the Sidney has laid down the very foundation of English criticism. Though he has borrowed some ideas from Aristotle and Plato, but he has given a way to new English critics, or he has laid foundation, very solid foundation for the coming generation critics. And it is one of the authoritative critic, English authoritative critic, we can say, for that matter, to Sidney. Why? Because Sidney was a poet and he composed very fine poetry in English literature, and so that he has very power to shed some light on this kind of things. And it is very necessary in that time when Gosson has composed the treatise School of Abuse, and it is directly addressed to Sir Philip Sidney, or it is dedicated without permission to Philip Sidney, and it was necessary to answer the charges of Gosson, and hence the very work of an apology for poetry is significant in English criticism. So thank you very much for watching the complete lesson. Friends, if you want more information or detailed analysis of the An Apology for Poetry, please visit website literaturesimply.com, where you find a very fine article which I composed and uploaded there, and you also can download this article for your further reference. So thank you very much for watching the lesson. Please share this video among your friends, like this video, and significantly subscribe to Literature Simply and press the bell notification icon for coming videos or updates.